As we all digest Jack Smith's brief to the Supreme Court on presidential immunity, thanks in part to Lisa Rubin and Sherrilyn Ifill for explaining it to us, we also heard today from a group of high-ranking former military officials who issued a dire warning in an amicus brief filed with the court. Those officials include retired four-star generals and admirals, as well as former secretaries of the Army, Navy, and Air Force, who served this country, and this is an important part, under presidents of both parties, from John F. Kennedy up to Donald Trump himself. Together, they argue that presidential immunity from criminal prosecution would threaten the military's role in American society, our nation's constitutional order, and our national security. They say that immunizing the president would place service members in the impossible position of having to choose between following their commander-in-chief and obeying the laws enacted by Congress. And they warn it would jeopardize America's standing as a guardian of democracy in the world and feed the spread of authoritarianism. It's a very powerfully written document. And joining me now, former Secretary of the Army, Luis Caldera, who is the chief signatory on that amicus brief. Sherrilyn Ifill is back with us as well. And Secretary Caldera, thank you so much for taking the time this evening. This is a very powerful brief. It's a very powerful argument. I tried to touch on some of the key points there, but tell us a little bit more about how you decided to sign on to it. You're the chief signatory, and what you hope people will take away.
Well, we thought it was very important to bring these national security issues to the Supreme Court's attention. These are very learned individuals, but none of them have ever served in the military. So when you talk about things like civilian control of the military, the importance of civil-military relations, how immunity of a president for criminal actions, immunity meaning that he could not be charged or prosecuted for criminal actions, how that would seriously threaten our national security. Because, for example, as you mentioned, the way the president would accomplish any of these goals, whether it was to assassinate a political rival or to use uniformed military soldiers against demonstrators that he disagreed with on our streets, something that is outlawed in the United States by the Posse Comitatus Act, the way he would do it is he wouldn't do it directly. He would order the military to use its might, its soldiers, its weapons in a way that was unlawful, whether on U.S. soil or in some other way. And when he transmits those orders, he transmits them through civilian appointees, the Secretary of Defense, the service secretaries, to the military, to the Chief of Staff of the Army, the Commander-in-Chief of the Joint Chiefs, down to the individual service member. All of those individuals swore an oath to defend the Constitution, to follow the orders of the President and those appointed over them, and to obey the law. And there's a thing called the duty to disobey, which means that you only have a duty to obey lawful orders. You have no duty, in fact, you have a duty not to obey unlawful orders. And this goes back to World War II and Nazi Germany when saying that you were just following orders became untenable as a defense. It is not recognized. You cannot just say, I was just following orders. So a president who is intent on violating the law because he's not subject to criminal prosecution would put the military officers and soldiers, the troops, in a position to do things that are unlawful for which they could be prosecuted. So that's a terrible dilemma to put service members in. And who would transmit those orders? It would be his political appointees who would either have to decide to resign because they couldn't pass on unlawful orders, or if they're so loyal to him, they would pass them on. And then it would be the generals who would have to either resign or transmit them or pass them on. That will destroy the relationships between our senior civilian appointed officials and the military leaders. The military leaders are career military leaders who've dedicated their lives to preserving our country. They are not politicians. The appointees are appointed political leaders. And the only way that civilian and military leadership works together is if there's fundamental trust between the civilian and military leaders, that we're all on the same page, that we're all trying to defend the country, defend the Constitution, obey the rule of law, do what's in the best interest of the country. But if you have a president who's intent to use the military for unlawful purposes, you've destroyed that unity that exists. You've destroyed that trust. You've created chaos in the ranks. You've put soldiers in an untenable position, created an incredible dilemma for them. You've probably misused the military in a way that average Americans are going to say, wait, our military is being used for political purposes, it will undermine support for the military. And it sends the wrong message to other countries in this world where our country is the vanguard of democracy. One of the things we actually try to teach in the military is to communicate to militaries and governments in other parts of the world that democracy is the best way to have stability and peace, where the people have a voice, where you follow the rule of law. And instead, it would set the example that that our democracy doesn't actually function because we have a president who has the kind of authority that Kim Jong-il has in North Korea, where he can do whatever he wishes and he is completely and totally immune from any accountability.
Secretary, that was such a well-stated, important message for people to hear out there, and I am so grateful you shared it and also wrote this brief. I want to ask you, Sherilyn, and I asked you to stay because I think it's so important for people to know, as such a respected legal expert as you are, why this is significant. The Secretary just broke down the impact, which is dramatic, on the chain of command, on men and women serving our country in the military, on how other countries see us. You summarized it better than I just did, but why is this important legally? Why is this a big deal in your view?
You know, first of all, I want to thank Secretary Caldera not only for this brief, but also for just the very, very powerful way you just explained what was important about it. Donald Trump has two ways that he is able to hold on to power. One is he undermines and unravels the rule of law. And the other is that he weakens and unravels core democratic institutions. The military is such an institution. You just heard the values and the laws and the rules and the ethical guidelines that govern the conduct of those who enter the military. And it is so powerful and important for the Supreme Court to understand that what feels for Trump, Trump is drowning, and a drowning man will often drown others with them. He is grasping, and he wants this cloak of immunity. And he is unconcerned about the fact that he will unravel the integrity of the military should he prevail in his argument. Remember also that Trump has very little respect for those in the military. These are the people he calls suckers and losers. These are the people who he feels if they are injured, he doesn't want them in parades or to be seen near him because it makes him look bad. So he doesn't have a lot of respect for the military. The second thing he doesn't have respect for is the rule of law. And I think what Secretary Caldera described is precisely what is happening in the civilian population. The more people believe that the president has impunity, can get away with anything, the less they believe that we really are a country that holds dear the rule of law. And once people stop believing that the rule of law is important, that there must be accountability for violations of law, that no one is above the law, the more that becomes inculcated in the American mind, the more we are going to have lawless and dangerous conduct. And in the context of the military, that is particularly disturbing. It was Donald Trump, you'll remember, who pardoned a Navy SEAL who had engaged in conduct for which he had been court-martialed. He made a hero of one of these individuals that he pardoned, who had been reported by his own fellow officers, and Trump pardoned him. So he is an unraveler of institutions and an unraveler of the rule of law. And the Supreme Court needed and needs to hear from these military leaders to explain what the effect of Trump's argument would be on the military, a core and critical institution of our democracy.
Secretary Caldera, Sherilyn Ifill, what a powerful, powerful conversation and discussion. I really appreciate you both joining me this evening.
Hey everyone, MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.